It begins in whispers, like a half-forgotten rumor crawling out of the soil. A tale so grotesque that even those who lived near it swore it was never real. They say there was once a man who walked the roads not clothed in fabric or wool, but in something far more unholy, his own skin. Villagers shuddered when his name surfaced, claiming they could hear the wet sound of his footsteps even before they saw him. The unsettling truth is this: some stories are buried because they are too monstrous to face. Yet the records remain, tucked away in yellowing archives, hinting at a man who believed he had discovered a higher state of existence by peeling away his own humanity. Hi everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon before this story pulls you in too deep. The disturbing truth begins in a nameless settlement that has since disappeared from modern maps, erased as though it never existed. In that place lived Elias Venn, a man who was not poor, not rich, but peculiar. Always speaking to himself in mutters. Always staring too long at the people around him, as though he were studying something invisible. He would tell the townsfolk that skin is the truest garment of God, a phrase so bizarre it became his mark. At first, they dismissed him as eccentric, but then the children began finding scraps of what looked like hide nailed into his fence posts. The texture was too smooth, the smell too wrong. Authorities quickly wrote it off as pigskin from slaughterhouse waste. Yet the whispers said otherwise. These weren't leftovers of an animal's carcass. They were pieces of Elias himself. By the 1920s, traveling salesmen passing through wrote unsettling notes in their diaries. A man wrapped in loose gray sheets of himself, walking the dirt road like death in a mask. Another wrote, "The smell, like blood soaked in leather." Even more disturbing is a note discovered decades later, written by a doctor who had examined Elias in 1924. He described patches of exposed muscle healing in unnatural ways, raw flesh somehow continuing to regenerate, while Elias draped himself in his discarded outer shell. The doctor concluded that Elias had somehow turned his own body into both prison and garment. And yet, Elias didn't hide in shame. He displayed his transformation as if it were holy. He would hang flaps of drying skin from his farmhouse windows, like a ghastly laundry, and wander the town with sagging sheets of himself still clinging to his frame. To his neighbors, he was not merely a man anymore. He was a thing, half dead and fully cursed. Two haunting images survive from the oral accounts of those years. A cracked farmhouse window, where they swore they saw strips of flesh swaying gently in the breeze, and a blurred, ghostly figure on a dirt road, pale, hunched, almost as though skin itself had decided to walk without a soul. The villagers did not speak of Elias Venn unless pressed, and even then their eyes would dart to the corners of the room as if something unseen might overhear. He was not a murderer in the conventional sense. He did not storm homes with a knife, nor did he bury bodies in shallow graves. His crime was something far more intimate, far more disturbing. It was the crime of turning himself into an object of horror. What unsettled his neighbors most was how methodical he seemed. He wasn't driven by rage or drunken violence. Elias documented everything. He wrote in journals about the layers of the self, describing skin as the mask that keeps us from the truth. He claimed every inch he removed brought him closer to God, closer to the pure core of his being. And in a twisted way, he believed he was offering proof to the world. But what kind of man could survive such atrocities against his own body? Some said he studied medicine. Others swore he dabbled in forbidden rituals imported from old European cults. In truth, no one could verify how he learned to peel his own flesh without succumbing to infection or death. It was whispered that he drank tinctures of herbs mixed with his own blood, dulling pain and slowing decay. Reports began surfacing of travelers who saw him walking along the outskirts of town at night. They described him as hollow, shrouded in a sagging mantle of his own making. One merchant swore he saw Elias pause beneath a lantern, his garment catching the light, and realized the folds of what looked like clothing were stitched human flesh. The local priest refused to bury Elias's family when they died, calling the household cursed. Children crossed the street rather than pass his property, and yet Elias never left. He grew bolder, nailing patches of his discarded self to the barn doors, a grotesque exhibition for anyone passing by. He called it his SC. By the mid-1920s, whispers about Elias Venn spread beyond the decaying town that tried so hard to silence him. Word traveled by merchants, drifting into neighboring villages, until his legend became something larger than the man himself. They called him the Walking Hide and the man who wore his own death. Some feared him as a demon, others pitied him as a man consumed by madness. But all agreed he had crossed a line that no human being was meant to cross. One faded letter, discovered in an attic nearly 50 years later, describes an encounter by a traveling teacher. She had rented a room for the night in the village and claimed she woke at dawn to see a man standing by the well, his body hunched, his outline distorted. At first she thought he wore rags, but when he turned, she saw what she believed were stitched folds of skin, sagging and darkened like dried parchment. His face, partly peeled, partly intact, looked less like a man and more like a mask melting off its own skull. She fled before sunrise, leaving her possessions behind. The horror of Elias was not only in what he did to himself, but in what it did to everyone around him. The town became poisoned by his presence. Families abandoned their homes, and small shops closed down. Even the soil seemed cursed. Farmers swore their livestock refused to graze near his property. The deeper researchers looked into his journals, the darker his beliefs became. He wrote of a cycle of renewal and claimed he could only ascend by discarding the false shell repeatedly. Elias believed that by removing his flesh, he was discarding sin, layer by layer, until only the purified self would remain. Each piece he cut away, each patch he wore, was a ritual. And yet, what remains most disturbing is that no one ever saw him collapse. No one ever saw him truly bleed out. It was as if his body defied death itself, or perhaps, as By the late 1920s, Elias Venn had become less a man and more a haunting presence. The few who dared to document him often did so in secrecy, fearful that even writing his name might invite misfortune. His neighbors lived in a strange purgatory, too terrified to confront him, yet too bound by shame to speak openly about what he had become. For them, Elias was not merely an eccentric recluse. He was a living wound on the land itself. Local folklore twisted around him like ivy around a gravestone. Mothers warned their children not to wander after dark, whispering that Elias would clothe them in their own skin. Teenagers, eager to test their bravery, sometimes crept near his property at night, only to run back pale and trembling, swearing they had seen sheets of flesh fluttering like tattered curtains in the moonlight. The police refused to intervene. One sheriff, after being pressed to investigate, wrote bluntly, "He is harming only himself. Let God deal with him." That indifference left the town at the mercy of their own imagination, each sighting more grotesque than the last. And yet, Elias was not content to remain a ghost locked inside his farmstead. Records show that on several occasions he walked into town, wearing what appeared to be his own garment of hardened, yellowed hide. Witnesses described a silence that fell over the marketplace when he appeared, people frozen in place, the sound of his slow footsteps echoing unnaturally. One account recalls a child beginning to scream uncontrollably, pointing at the folds of flesh that seemed stitched together like a crude patchwork coat. Elias said nothing. He only watched and then walked away. His writings from this period reveal a disturbing clarity. He no longer spoke of madness or delirium. Instead, his words became almost evangelical. He described himself as a living testament to man's ability to transcend. The final years of Elias Venn's life remain shrouded in uncertainty, preserved only through scraps of testimony and fragments of decaying journals. What is clear, however, is that his obsession deepened into something darker than ritual. By 1930, Elias was no longer seen in the marketplace. He confined himself to his farmstead, his property rotting around him, the barn doors warped by rain and sun, the windows smeared with something neighbors refused to describe. Travelers reported that even the crows avoided his land, circling overhead but never descending. One faded diary entry from a young schoolteacher described passing the Venn property on her way home. She wrote of hearing a sound she could not forget, something between a wet tearing and the low hum of chanting. When she glanced toward the farmhouse, she saw Elias standing in the doorway, his arms outstretched, his garment clinging to him like a second shadow. She described it as both horrifying and strangely ceremonial, as if he were offering himself to something unseen. By then, the townspeople had grown desperate. Crops failed, animals sickened, and locals swore Elias was to blame. They believed his rituals poisoned the very soil, that his discarded flesh cursed the land. Some whispered that if he wasn't stopped, he would bring death to the entire valley. But fear of him, fear of what he had become, kept them from acting. No one dared set foot past his fence line. In 1932, a fire consumed part of the Venn farmhouse. Witnesses claimed it burned with an intensity far greater than ordinary timber, the flames fed by something unnatural. And yet, when the smoke cleared, Elias was still alive. He was seen wandering the yard days later, his body covered in blackened sheets of hardened skin, moving with a stiffness that no longer looked human. His journals from those years are the most unsettling of all. In one end, after Elias Venn's disappearance in 1934, the land he left behind became a scar no one dared to touch. For years, his farmstead sat in silence, the house collapsing inward, the barn groaning against the wind. Yet no one from the town would step foot on the property. Children were warned never to cross the boundary fence, and those who did claimed they heard whispers inside the ruins, as though Elias himself was still muttering from the shadows. The site quickly grew into something darker than memory. It became legend. In the decades that followed, researchers, journalists, and thrill-seekers tried to uncover what had happened. Some believed Elias fled into the wilderness, living as a hermit, wearing the hardened remnants of his flesh, until death finally claimed him. Others theorized he burned entirely in the fire, leaving nothing behind but ash. But then, there were the stranger claims, accounts of sightings long after his supposed death. A hunter in 1941 wrote that he encountered a pale figure in the woods near the valley. He described the smell before he saw it. Metallic, thick, like blood gone sour. When the figure stepped from behind a tree, its body sagged with folds like old leather, and its face, half obscured, half peeled, watched him with eyes that seemed too alive. The hunter dropped his rifle and ran. Still more unsettling were the rumors that pieces of Elias's garments were found decades later. In the 1950s, demolition workers tearing down an abandoned barn nearby reported finding stiffened sheets of what appeared to be leather nailed to the walls. When tested years later, the samples were identified not as animal hide, but as human. And so the myth deepened. Elias became a figure caught between fact and folklore, a man who mutilated himself not for spectacle, but for belief. His journals were eventually collected by historians, though many pages had rot, dead beyond recovery. The surviving fragments show no remorse, no fear, only conviction. He wrote of shedding the false vessel and walking in truth. But perhaps the most disturbing element of all is this. No official record of his death exists. His name is absent from church logs, court files, or medical records. It is as though Elias Venn simply dissolved into the earth, leaving behind only his legend and the smell of leather that never quite faded from the valley air. What remains of the story of Elias Venn is not found in graves, nor in any marked archive, but in the unease that lingers like a shadow over the forgotten valley. Locals still lower their voices when his name is mentioned, as though he might hear. For them, Elias is less a man of history and more a reminder that human obsession can rot into something unrecognizable. Scholars who studied his writings concluded that Elias never saw himself as a criminal or even a madman. He considered his actions a sacred journey, an evolution beyond humanity. He was convinced that by discarding the layers of his flesh, he was discarding the lies of mankind itself. And yet, his belief gave no comfort to those forced to live near him. For them, his presence was like a curse carved into the earth. Even today, visitors to the site of his ruined farmstead report strange sensations. Some claim to hear faint creaking, as if nails are still being driven into wood. Others swear they smell iron and smoke on the wind, though nothing burns nearby. The ruins are said to glow faintly under the moonlight, and more than one traveler has reported the fleeting image of a pale figure standing in the collapsed doorway, watching, waiting. Perhaps the most haunting question is this: did Elias Venn die, or did he succeed? His journals suggest he believed there would come a day when he would shed the final layer and rise as something more than human. If so, then his disappearance was not a failure, but his final act of transformation. Whether he perished in the flames, wandered into the woods, or became something beyond explanation, we cannot know. But the town's silence is telling. No memorial was ever erected. No official acknowledgement was given. It was as though they sought to erase him from history, burying his name along with the horrors he left behind. Yet silence often speaks louder than words. And so the story of the man who wore his own skin survives not as fact, nor as fiction, but as a wound in memory. A wound that festers whenever someone dares to uncover it again.